Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Exploring the Inner Addict Part 3 with Lisa Saremi. My name is Nicole, and I'm on the Access Elite team that has brought this event to you. For those of you who aren't familiar, Access Elite is a health and wellness company providing team building, social wellness, and connection through our on-demand classes and live events such as these. We're always so excited to bring some positivity and connection to your day, so I just want to take a moment and thank you all for joining. And with that, I'm thrilled to introduce our guest. With us, we have Lisa. She is a transformational coach, a marriage and family therapist, and a yoga therapist. And with that, Lisa, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nicole, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon or morning, and looking forward to exploring the third part of our series on the inner addict. And the reason why I called it the inner addict is so that we can see that even though we might not identify as an alcoholic or a drug addict or a food addict, and we're going to get into the different types of ways that addiction manifests, that we all might consider that there might be a part of us on the inside that might have some of these addictive tendencies, and to explore how they manifest in our lives. So with that said, let me go ahead and get the screen shared. We will just dive right in. Manifestations of addiction. That's kind of the topic today. And just to kind of review, in case you weren't with us the last couple weeks, the first week we went over the different dimensions that kind of encompass what I'm talking about as an inner addict, as an archetypal pattern that might live in us. And then in week 2, which was last week, we really got into what is this addictive cycle? And what's really behind it? And how does it interact and interplay with different types of behaviors or substances? And today we're going to dive into really just kind of peeling away the layers of how does addiction potentially manifest in our worlds, and what are the different ways that it might show up. And then when we finalize our series, I'll be getting into just some ways that we can work with that inner addict in our lives. So today, just a little outline of what we'll be covering. We're going to review a little bit of the last 2 weeks so that today's content also lands if this is the first time you've joined in. We're going to go over really the main 2 types of addictions. They're behavioral and they're substance. And we're going to peel away, the different ways and forms that they might show up. And then we'll do a little review to hone it all in. So let's do a little review to open it up. The definition of addiction, it's a good one to connect to, because sometimes, we might, as a human being, feel deep cravings or desires, or even do behaviors that might be a little self-sabotagey in a way. However, just because we might participate once in a while in something like that, it does not mean that we're an addict, right? So what is it that makes addiction? It's when it gets to a place where that behavior is obsessive, compulsive, out of control. It's done in spite of any negative consequences that one might be experiencing either to themselves, or negative consequences that others might be experiencing due to this behavior. So this is a definition that was given to me by Dr. Carol Clark. And I really appreciated her definition because it took the substance piece away. And it really, with a lot of my clients that actually do have substance addictions, it gave them a space to be able to actually own that, yeah, you know what, there is an addiction here. And it's not just about removing a substance. It's about really, how do I work with that inner addict? And of course, removing substance might be a part of that, right? But how do I work with that inner addict so it doesn't act out in other ways in my life? We went over the archetype of the addict. So archetypal patterns are, or archetypes are patterns of behavior that we see in the collective that helps us identify or define certain words, right? So when I say addict, you might already have a sense of what that looks like. Now, archetypally, the addict has light and shadow aspects, just like we do. All archetypes do. And the recognition of addiction and the shadow components of addiction that compromises our integrity and our honesty is actually the light piece of this archetype, because it's the part of the archetype that can actually recognize that something's not working here, right? And that it's taking them away from a bigger purpose and from connecting to oneself and to the people that they love, as well as that purpose. The addictive pattern begins to take authority of the addict's inner spirit. And so that's kind of like the shadowy part of it, right? Is that in addition to the compromise of integrity and honesty, that pattern of behavior begins to kind of cloud or diminish one's access to their own inner spirit or inner light. And many times the archetype of the addict is moving through a dance of a lot of control and chaos. The addiction becomes actually a way to feel like they're in control, because internally they feel like there's a lot of chaos there. And so what we did that very first session is we just took a moment to kind of take the mirror and place it in front of us and to really ask ourselves some questions. Like, what are our cravings? What are those things? Are they people in our lives? Are they food? Or is it a substance? Is it a behavior? Is it unconscious? Is it in your consciousness? Are you able to identify it? Are you able to observe it? And then the thing is like, okay, we're human. We're going to have cravings. That's natural. We all have desire. But when that desire takes us out of balance in our lives, that's when we really want to look and see, is this behavior or this craving now slipping through the boundary into more of an addiction or addictive type experience? So one of the things that can help us identify if we've gone into that space is that internal voice, the addict's voice. The addict's voice will say, like, I deserve, or what about me? You know, especially when there's any restriction being brought forward. So I want to just throw out a quick little example, and I am going to use a substance because most of us, or many of us, have had maybe some experience with alcohol in our lives. Maybe we have a glass of wine or a cocktail or a beer every now and again. But if we end up in a place where we start to question or we start to try to control our usage of that alcohol because we're feeling obsessive, compulsive, or out of control from being able to consciously choose yes or no, then we might start to justify with that inner voice, saying things to ourselves like, I deserve, or what about me? So that was a review of our first session and session 2. Session 2 was really kind of getting into that addiction cycle. I didn't get into the cycle that you're actually seeing the image below. I mean, there is an emotional cycle that also occurs with addiction, but the main thing that I really wanted us to walk away from in reference to the addictive cycle is really how the brain interacts or functions with this cycle, and how we have this caveman part of our brain that recognizes any type of stimulation. It might come from a release of a chemical. It might come. Now, here's the thing. This is how we get into the behavioral piece, right? So if we're actually taking a drug or we're taking a substance, right, we might have that chemical release. But when it's behavior, there's still a release of some kind of chemical. It's called dopamine and adrenaline, and it's our internal pharmacy, so to speak. So the stimulation of the caveman part of the brain, the amygdala, releases, it sends a message down to release these internal hormones. And then we feel them, right? As a woman, if you go through a cycle, as a woman, we have cycles. We all know what it feels like to get hijacked by our emotions, because it's like that one time a month when we're not almost like the same person. And if you're a man joining us, I'm sure you've been around a woman who's in her cycle and maybe you didn't recognize who was in that same body, right? Now, so what I want to really hone it into here is that addictive cycle is really driven by stimulation. And that's the whole kind of premise behind Dr. Carol Clark and this presentation also, is that it's the stimulation that we're addicted to as human beings, as a society, as a collective. And then eventually, when that stimulation, we get addicted to it, it's because that dopamine is getting released. Eventually, the addict brain doesn't care where it's getting the stimulation from. So the addict brain will put into motion another type of chain of events just to find that stimulation again. It's going to find a replacement. If a regular one is not available, it'll go to something else. Now, the addict brain is always craving stimulation. In fact, it's either in one of these four places typically. It's either thinking about the substance or the stimulation, the thing they're going to do, right? So they're already connecting to it. They're already starting to get that high. Then there might be a preparation for it, then receiving it, and then the recovering from its effects. This is not linear. Addiction is circular. It's definitely not linear. It's not like step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. But once we get in it, it's a very circular motion, like many things in our lives. So let's get into a little more of the details around what are the types of addictions. Now, addiction, again, it's the dopamine release is really our brain's reward system. And it gets rewired when we constantly use a substance or engage in an activity, and those hormones get released. Another example of this, and some of you may have been with me when we did our series on sleep, it's similar to the rewiring of the hormones in our body, like the cortisol release and the melatonin release, that might happen over a period of time. And it's possible to undo this, but it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes consistency. So let's look at what are some of the different portals of dopamine release, okay? Let's look specifically at substances. There's alcohol, we're all familiar with that one, cocaine, marijuana. Here's one that's really an epidemic today, prescription drugs. Maybe that's something you already knew, maybe this is an aha moment for you, but the opioid issue that we have in the world, it started with the prescription drugs. I have had several clients that I have worked with that have told me, we've been working on addiction was like their purpose for our work together. And they would tell me their story about how they became hooked on heroin. And it always seemed to have started, at least with these clients, with a pill first, a prescription pill. And then now I do want to say it's not always a prescription pill that they necessarily were prescribed, right? It could have been something that they got off the market. But here's what happened is eventually those pills are expensive and they're hard to get, right? So eventually when they couldn't get those pills, then they ended up going to the street drugs. And then they ended up getting the heroin off the streets. Methamphetamine and hallucinogens are also some other types of substances that can be addictive. Now, here's something that's not on here. Food. It gets tricky when we start to find this cycle of addiction to things that we actually need to live. So as we move over to behavioral addictions, we'll see another thing that to me is like food, which is love, relationships. We'll talk about that in a minute. But as far as the substances are concerned, I want you to really just think for a moment. Like, this might be, maybe you yourself had a substance addiction at one point and went through the process of recovery. Maybe you know somebody that has. I know a lot of people, and I really want to like honor and respect like what it's taken for them to accumulate years under their belt of sobriety, right? So I have one person in particular I'm thinking about. She's been sober for over 6 years. It's beautiful. Wow. And the stories, right, of just the removal of that one substance from her life are miraculous. Now, the thing is the addiction within her, she's not using drugs. She's not using alcohol. She's not using substance. Actually, nicotine is a substance she does use. She vapes. But that addictive behavior, that addictive piece, it's still kind of palpable and alive, although she is in recovery. So in the world of addiction, they say you're either in your addiction or you're in recovery, right? So you could think of it as we're peeling away these layers and we're starting to really look at what might be some of my addictions. Maybe you, at the end, you're like, wow, I don't have any. That's amazing. But really looking at like how they show up, when they show up, and when you feel connected to that definition of feeling obsessive, compulsive, when you can observe that reward system at play, and when you're reallocating, if you did have an addictive history, that energy into other areas. I had another client that had a serious marijuana addiction. And, well, actually, okay, let's back it up. So she was an addict. And at the time that I started actually working with her, her addiction was being manifested and expressed through tobacco. And she had stopped smoking marijuana, and she had stopped doing, I think that was the main thing. But what was happening was now she was smoking tobacco. So then she wanted to stop doing that. So I worked with her on that. And then it was like that inner addict. She called it the gremlin. I might have mentioned the gremlin in one of the previous sessions, would show up. And then so how it would manifest is sometimes she would end up on Amazon and shop a lot. Sometimes she would end up, smoking the tobacco. And the other way it would manifest is the way she was in her relationships with men. So at some point in the process, she was going through school. We consciously made a decision. We collaborated. And the decision was she was going to choose the addiction that was least harmful because she actually didn't feel like she was in a space to really take on her addict and work on that. So she chose one substance and continued that substance. And once she finally completed school, she actually came back and was ready to work on the addiction. So this part of us, it's going to show up in different ways. And what we want to do is we want to notice when it does. And maybe like next session, we'll get more into like, well, how do we work with that inner addict? We start to notice first how it lives within us, how it exists, how it holds space, and the real estate it occupies in our lives. So, so that's the way they might manifest as far as substances are concerned. Now I want to get into behavioral addictions. Behavioral addictions, in my view, can be even more challenging. Now, food is on this side too, in a way, because there is a behavioral piece with food. Some people might hear food and think, oh, well, this is an addiction that consists of eating. And yes, some people are addicted to eating, right? Like they get the stimulation from the food and that other piece of the addictive cycle. There are other things that happen emotionally when we're going through that cycle that keeps them alive. However, food can also show up as a behavioral addiction because Some people are on the other side of the spectrum where the relationship to food is not a healthy relationship. And so it might express itself in the form of anorexia or bulimia. And in those cases, it's behavioral, right? Because there is either restriction, and that restriction in anorexia is that sense of being in control. And then with bulimia, it's the behavior is, right, regurgitating and binging. And so the behavioral piece of the addiction is what we want to work with when we're working with anorexia and bulimia. And then there's other behavioral addictions: pornography, sex, love, exercise, the internet, our phones, video games, spirituality, pain, cutting, picking, shopping, working. I had sex on there. And the other one I want to just kind of slip in there is stress, right? I have another client that ended up in a place in her life where she just financially was really feeling a lot of pressure. And it was like she kind of went into this overdrive mode. And for a short period of time, she was deeply in her fight and flight state. In fact, one of her eyes kind of almost froze, bulging out of her face. And it was because of the stress. Now, interestingly enough, when those projects that were stressing her out kind of got settled, it wasn't very long before she created another one. And she, now I notice, tends to choose things in her life that stimulate that state of stress. And we're exploring how that might actually be an addiction that she can work on. So experts agree that addiction is a real disease. It's not a moral weakness or a character flaw. What I'd like to acknowledge is that addiction is a coping mechanism. So whatever is driving someone to that obsessive and compulsive behavior, we might consider that at some point and at some time, that behavior was a coping mechanism. And then as it started to become a part of the addictive cycle, it might have turned into an addiction because of the releases that happen within our biology. Here are some of the most common ones. So the most common behavioral addictions are gambling, sex addiction, internet addiction, shopping addiction. I mean, Amazon, gosh, like getting right in there with the people wanting to feel connected. I mean, there's something about receiving those boxes in the mail that can actually give people that release of dopamine. The video game addiction, plastic surgery addiction. I didn't have it on the other slide, but like that's a real thing, right? Like these days people go to the doctor and they do there's ways that they can like tend to their appearance, and that can also become very, not just addictive, but expensive. And then, as I mentioned, binge eating disorder or food addiction, number 7. Number 8, risky behavior addiction. And you might even just think about, like, after everything that we've gone over the last 3 weeks, like, what does risky behavior do? It gets your heart pumping. It gets you kind of high. The adrenaline starts to run through your veins. Hopefully this is all starting to make a little more sense. So some of the most common substance addictions. Alcohol is at the top, and I don't think COVID has helped in that matter. Tobacco is number 2. Opioids, number 3. Now, I just want to also speak to something right here for a moment. Not tobacco, but alcohol and opioids. These are 2 of the substances out there that actually, if you just stop cold turkey, it's dangerous. I have a friend, that same friend who was, not friend, she's a client, that just was sharing that she just had a friend of hers drive down from out of state, shaking, asking to stay with her and her husband because he wants to quit drinking. That he was detoxing off the alcohol, and she knows how critical and dangerous it can be. So she was trying to encourage him to get medical support. Really important if you're around somebody that is trying to come off something like that, that you encourage that they do it in a very like safe way so that they don't compromise their livelihood. And then in addition to opioids, which is also a prescriptive drug, right? But it's also heroin, there's other prescriptive drugs like sleeping pills, sedatives, hypnotics, anxiolytics. Those are the sleeping pills. I know I'm not pronouncing that right. The fifth one is cocaine. The sixth one is cannabis, believe it or not. Number 7, cannabis has got methamphetamines, beat. 8 is hallucinogens. 9 is inhalants. And then 10 is that PCP or angel dust. So I just want to kind of review. It's a lot of information at a deeper level than maybe we've or you have gone down before. So the inner addict is something that can manifest, an archetypal pattern actually, that can manifest in our lives in many ways. And what that addict is seeking is stimulation. And it will continue to hunt for it and find different ways to satiate that craving. It is truly the addiction to the inner producing of the substances of dopamine and adrenaline that take it from a normal behavior into an addiction. At some point in the journey, there's a breaking point. And that dopamine production doesn't feel satisfying. And that's when it becomes this unsatiated feeling that breaks it into addiction, because we're looking for more of that stimulation to boost more dopamine and more of those feel-good hormones. That kind of wraps up today. I hope it was useful and maybe gave you a wider scope of understanding around addiction and how it's not just a substance issue. It's a much bigger issue that's guided around stimulation and our need and addiction to stimulation as human beings. Next session, we're going to go over just some ways to regulate our inner addict. And just a reminder, the modalities I love to work with when I work with clients is an integration of yoga as a way to learn better ways to regulate self, manage the biology, the nervous system, and then a dive into depth psychology that allows us to deepen meaning and purpose in our lives through a lot of different modalities. And of course, as an Access Elite member, I offer discounted prices just for you. We'll open it up to any questions or comments that anyone has, and also back to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Lisa. At this time, if you guys have any questions or points of discussion you want to bring up, we do have a few minutes for that. So we'll give you guys a second to say anything you might have on your mind.
I just want to say thank you, Lisa, and hi, how are you all guys? No, I don't have any questions today, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for joining, Camille.
I feel like we are classmates.
Kind of are. No grades, no tests.
Yeah, that's good.
Except for our own test of life with all of this knowledge.
Right, that's true, Nicole. Yeah.
We'll have Lisa talking to us.
Yeah.
I'm just curious. Can I ask you guys, ladies, a question since we've opened it up? I'm just curious, like, so far the information on the inner addict, has it opened up anything for you, like perspective wise, as far as the way you might look at addiction and yourselves?
I've learned new things. I'm not, thankfully I don't know anybody like close that is an addict per se, or has any of those tendencies, but and I try not to deal with those type of people. My sister is actually a psychologist, and she's the one that deals with that. But I'm the free spirited bird. But it's good to have the awareness. So when you make new friends or friends of friends, you know if something's going on, red flags, show up. But for me, it's just brand new information to learn, and you explain it so well. That yeah, it sticks with me. And sometimes I'm thinking, am I being an addict, turning on my phone all the time, or whatever little thing I'm eating every day. But yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. It was definitely an eye-opener to me when Dr. Carol Cloak wrote the book Addicted America or something like that. But I was like, oh my gosh, like we're all running around. We're all so busy. We're all like, hamsters kind of on this wheel. And then when she said the whole thing, like bringing in that idea that it's the stimulation that releases this internal drug, right? It was like, wow, we're all kind of running around with that on some level.
Have you, I haven't watched the movie yet because I think I'm going to get depressed, but have you watched The Social Dilemma? Apparently it's related to, how those companies make you an addict to the phone, because every time you open it, your dopamine and all those nice hormones turn on every time you look at your phone, and all the gratification that is excessive that we get right there on our hand. That's why I don't want to watch it, because I think I'm going to be so depressed about it. But yeah. Have you watched it?
I have. And I think, thank you for opening up. What I'd like to just say here is, what we need to be aware of, I think, is that, things like social media, the news, and big companies, right? Big companies that are very big profiteering companies, organizations, they bring the psychology into what they do. They do it with purpose. They're very clear how we work as human beings. And so I think that's what that documentary really unfolds, is it shows us how they understand that. And everything that they do on the back end is really designed to keep us plugged in, right? With the social media, for example. But every big company, the news, I always talk about how they're like, fear, 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 because they know that that's going to keep people coming back. Nobody wants to hear about sunny days.
It's everywhere. Yeah.
Right.
Even processed foods, right? Like they explain that those foods have certain tastes that keep you hooked to it. And if you eat the natural foods, that's why you won't be that fat or that unhealthy, because you will be eating the right amount. You won't be craving it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So we have to really, I think, just bring our consciousness and our discernment into our daily activities in our lives, and really ask those questions like, is this truth? Is this my truth? Are they setting me up for an addiction I never had? And how am I going to meet that?
Yeah, Camille, I recommend watching that one. It's really eye-opening.
Yeah, I definitely have to sit down, take a deep breath, and watch it. I know what they're doing, but it's like the movies about the meat and the meat processing factories and things that I know what they're doing, but I really don't.
I know.
I suffer so much watching it.
It's always striking to see it in that type of light.
Yes.
But it definitely makes you take a step back and realize how much we need to start tuning in with our own emotions and releases of our dopamine and our other serotonin receptors and everything, so that we can control those ourselves and not let them be controlled by external things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why we have Access Elite, to discuss about it.
Yes. Yeah, and remind us all the time.
Yeah, it's really powerful when you're like, wow, I just felt like I can't remember exactly what I was doing or whatever. I just remember one day I literally felt a release of a hormone in my body, and I felt good. Like it was like, oh, I feel so good right now, and it was like, okay. something just got released. What am I doing? Just bringing that consciousness to where is that happening in our lives? And is it serving us? Because sometimes, you know what, like when we go exercise and stuff, like maybe it is serving us. But if we get obsessive, compulsive, and it starts to have negative consequences on ourselves or the people around us, then we have to like take a harder look, right?
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. It's always so informative to have these sessions with you.
Absolutely.
We have our part 4 coming up, so we will be in touch about the time and schedule for that event. But thank you everyone for joining in, and we'll see you guys all soon.
Have a beautiful day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.